November 12, 1944. The transport truck rumbled through the flat Illinois countryside toward Camp Ellis, carrying 43 German women who had been captured during the Allied advance through France. They sat in silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms wrinkled and stained from weeks of processing through military channels. Most kept their eyes fixed on the truck bed floor, refusing to meet the gaze of the American guards who accompanied them. Among them sat Ursula Braun, 24 years old, a former administrative coordinator from Dresden, who had volunteered for the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1942. She held herself with rigid posture despite the truck's jostling, her dark blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun that had somehow survived the chaos of capture and transport. In her pocket, she clutched a small photograph of her family, the edges worn soft from constant handling. The propaganda she had absorbed during her years of service told her what to expect from American captivity: brutality, humiliation, perhaps worse. She had been trained to believe that Americans were barbarians, hiding behind a facade of civilization, that their wealth was stolen from conquered peoples, that their democracy was a lie designed to mask their true cruelty. As the truck slowed and turned through a gate, Ursula finally allowed herself to look up. What she saw confused her. The camp before them looked almost disappointingly ordinary. Neat rows of wooden barracks, well-maintained grounds, American soldiers moving about their duties with casual efficiency rather than menacing aggression. The truck stopped and an American officer approached, a woman in her 30s with captain's insignia on her uniform. Captain Helen Morrison gestured for the German women to disembark, speaking in heavily accented German about camp rules and procedures. They would be housed in Barracks 7 and 8. They would receive 3 meals daily. They would be assigned work details appropriate to their skills. They would be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. The words sounded too good to be true, which made Ursula more suspicious rather than less. This had to be some kind of American trick, a psychological warfare tactic designed to lower their guard before the real cruelty began. Inside the barracks, the women found rows of metal frame beds, each with a thin mattress, 2 blankets, and a pillow. At the foot of each bed sat a small wooden footlocker. It was Spartan, but far from the punishment cell conditions Ursula had been led to expect. Senta Huber, the youngest of their group at 19, sat tentatively on one of the beds. Her round face still held traces of adolescent softness despite months of rationed food. "It's not what they told us it would be like," Senta whispered in German. Ursula's jaw tightened. "It's exactly what they told us. Americans lie with comfort before they strike with cruelty. Don't be fooled." But even as she spoke with conviction, a small seed of doubt had begun to take root in her mind. The mess hall bell rang at 1800 hours, a sharp metallic sound that made several of the German women flinch. They had been given 30 minutes to settle into their barracks before being summoned for their first meal. Ursula led the group across the compound, maintaining the military bearing that had been drilled into her during training. She refused to show weakness or confusion in front of their captors. The mess hall was a long wooden building filled with rows of tables and benches. American soldiers occupied roughly half the space, eating and talking in relaxed clusters. The sight of men and women dining together so casually struck Ursula as improper, almost indecent. In Germany, military discipline maintained stricter separation, but what truly shocked her was what happened when they reached the serving line. An American private, a boy who looked barely 20 years old with red hair and freckles, began loading their metal trays with food: mashed potatoes, green beans, 2 thick slices of roast beef, a roll with butter, a cup of coffee, and a small square of chocolate cake for dessert. Ursula stared at her tray in disbelief. This was more food than she had seen in a single meal in over 2 years. In Germany, rations had been steadily decreasing since 1942. Meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions. Butter was a distant memory. Chocolate was something children dreamed about but never tasted. Yet here she stood, a prisoner of war, holding a tray laden with abundance that would feed her entire family back home for days. Helga Kruger, a former teacher from Berlin with sharp eyes and a sharper mind, leaned close as they found seats at an empty table. "This can't be real food," she whispered in German. "It must be drugged or poisoned. Why else would they feed prisoners better than their own civilians?" But the American soldiers were eating the same food from the same kitchen. Ursula watched them carefully, noting how they took the abundance for granted, some even leaving food uneaten on their trays. The casual waste shocked her more than the quantity. These men were throwing away what would be precious in Germany. Wilhelmina Schulze, called Mina by everyone, sat across from Ursula with her tray untouched. At 23, she had worked as a communications specialist, and her analytical mind was clearly racing. "If this is standard prison food," Mina said quietly, "what do their civilians eat? What do their soldiers in combat receive?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications none of them wanted to acknowledge. If the propaganda had lied about American poverty and desperation, what else had been a lie? Ursula picked up her fork, her hand trembling slightly. The first bite of roast beef melted in her mouth, rich and flavorful in a way she had almost forgotten food could be. Around her, the other German women began to eat, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency as hunger overcame suspicion. But with each bite, the foundation of everything they believed began to crack just a little bit more. Ursula Braun lay awake that first night in Camp Ellis, staring at the rough wooden ceiling of Barrack 7. Around her, 42 other German women slept or pretended to sleep, each processing in their own way what they had experienced during their first hours in American captivity. The meal haunted her, not just the abundance of it, but the casual nature of that abundance. The American guards had shown no special attention to the food service, no pride in displaying their superiority. They had simply served standard prison rations, as if feeding captured enemies generously was the most normal thing in the world. Ursula had been raised in Dresden in a middle-class family. Her father worked as an accountant. Her mother managed their household with the efficient precision expected of German women. She had two younger brothers who had both joined the Wehrmacht, their whereabouts now unknown to her. She had believed in the Reich not out of fanaticism, but out of patriotism, out of faith that her country's leaders knew what was necessary for Germany's survival and prosperity. When the Women's Auxiliary Corps had called for volunteers in 1942, Ursula had stepped forward without hesitation. She had been assigned to administrative coordination in occupied France, managing supply records and personnel files. She had never fired a weapon, never directly participated in combat operations, but she had believed she was serving a righteous cause, defending her homeland against enemies who wanted to destroy German culture and enslave German people. The propaganda had been consistent and convincing. America was portrayed as a failing democracy, torn apart by racial strife and economic collapse. American soldiers were depicted as undisciplined criminals, their military effectiveness a myth perpetuated by Jewish-controlled media. American abundance was described as a facade, hiding desperate poverty and social disintegration. Yet the evidence of her own eyes contradicted every single claim. The camp was well organized and professionally run. The American soldiers were disciplined and seemed well trained. The food was not just adequate, but generous, suggesting resources far beyond what propaganda had claimed. Ursula rolled onto her side, pulling the surprisingly clean blanket closer. 2 beds away, she could hear Senta crying softly in the darkness. The girl was homesick, frightened, and too young to have developed the hardened shell that older prisoners cultivated. Tomorrow, they would begin work assignments. Tomorrow they would interact more directly with their American captors. Tomorrow would bring more evidence that would either confirm her beliefs or continue to undermine them. Part of Ursula desperately wanted to cling to what she had been taught, to find explanations that preserved her worldview. Perhaps this camp was exceptional, designed specifically for propaganda purposes. Perhaps the food abundance was temporary, meant to soften them before interrogation. Perhaps everything would soon reveal itself to be the elaborate deception she had been warned about. But another part of her, a part she tried to suppress, whispered that perhaps she had been the one deceived all along, that perhaps the real propaganda had come from her own government, not from the enemy, that perhaps everything she had believed and served had been built on lies. The thought terrified her more than any physical threat the Americans could pose. The morning of November 13th dawned cold and gray over Camp Ellis. Ursula woke to the sound of a bugle playing reveille, a military convention that felt oddly familiar despite the foreign setting. The German women dressed quickly in the same auxiliary uniforms they had worn since capture, their clothing wrinkled but reasonably clean. After another abundant breakfast that left them uncomfortable with fullness, Captain Morrison announced work assignments. The women would be divided into groups based on their previous skills and training. Some would work in the camp laundry, others in the kitchen, still others in administrative offices or the medical facility. Ursula found herself assigned to the camp's central administration building along with Mina and Helga. They would be sorting and filing paperwork under the supervision of an American sergeant. The work itself was mundane and familiar, the kind of bureaucratic labor Ursula had performed throughout her service. But the working conditions were startling. The office was heated. Coffee was available throughout the day. The American staff treated them not as enemies, but as temporary workers, giving instructions without hostility and offering corrections without cruelty. Sergeant Thomas Bradley, a middle-aged man from Ohio with graying hair and kind eyes, seemed genuinely interested in making sure they understood their tasks. He spoke no German, but he used patient gestures and simple English words, repeating himself without frustration when they didn't immediately comprehend. During their mid-morning break, he offered them coffee and cookies from a tin on his desk. Cookies. Not military rations, but actual cookies that someone had baked. Probably his wife, based on the domestic tin they came from. He shared them as casually as he might share with American colleagues. Meanwhile, in the medical facility, Adelheid Zimmerman was experiencing her own moment of cognitive dissonance. Called Heidi by everyone who knew her, she had trained as a nurse before the war and had served in field hospitals in France. She expected American medical facilities to be crude and undersupplied based on propaganda claims about American industrial inadequacy. Instead, she found herself in a clean, well-equipped infirmary that rivaled or exceeded the German facilities she had worked in. The American medical officer, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, treated Heidi not as a prisoner, but as a fellow medical professional. She showed Heidi the supply rooms, explained their procedures, and even asked for Heidi's opinion on patient care protocols. The respect in her voice was genuine, not performative. In the camp laundry, young Santa worked alongside an American private named James Cooper, a farm boy from Iowa who had been assigned to supervise the laundry detail. He noticed Santa struggling with the American washing machines, which were far more advanced than anything she had seen in Germany. Without condescension, he showed her how to operate them, his hands guiding hers through the process with professional courtesy. These small kindnesses accumulated throughout that first full day of work. Not dramatic gestures, not obvious attempts at manipulation, but simple human decency extended across enemy lines. By evening, when the German women gathered in their barracks, the conversations had begun to shift from suspicious analysis to confused acknowledgement. Something was happening that none of them had been prepared for. 3 weeks into their captivity, the German women had settled into an uneasy routine at Camp Ellis. The work was manageable, the food remained abundant, and the American staff continued their pattern of professional courtesy that contradicted everything the prisoners had been taught to expect. But they still maintained emotional distance, still waited for the other shoe to drop, still believed that American kindness must be hiding American cruelty. It was December 5, 1944, during the afternoon break in the administration building, when everything changed. Sergeant Bradley had brought in a cardboard box from the camp commissary, setting it on his desk while he sorted through paperwork. Ursula watched from her filing station as he opened the box and pulled out smaller individual boxes, each bearing colorful printing and images. He called Mina over with a friendly gesture, holding out one of the small boxes to her. Mina approached cautiously, taking the offered item with uncertain hands. The box was red and yellow, with the words Cracker Jack printed in bold letters above an image of a sailor boy and his dog. She turned it over, examining it with the careful attention of someone trained to analyze everything for hidden meaning. Sergeant Bradley pantomimed eating, then pointed at the box and smiled. "Candy and peanuts," he said slowly in English. "Caramel popcorn. Good." He handed boxes to Ursula and Helga as well, then distributed them to other prisoners working in nearby offices. Ursula opened her box carefully, the sweet smell of caramel hitting her immediately. Inside, she found candied popcorn and peanuts coated in a glossy brown glaze. She took a small piece tentatively, tasting it. The sweetness was almost overwhelming after years of sugar rationing. But then Mina made a small sound of surprise. She had poured the contents into her hand and found something unexpected among the candied pieces. A small wrapped package containing a tiny toy, a miniature metal whistle painted red. "There's something inside," Mina said in German, her voice filled with confusion. "There's a toy inside the candy." Helga opened her box and found a small puzzle. Ursula discovered a tiny compass. Each box contained a different prize, a small treasure hidden among the sweets. The concept was incomprehensible. Why would anyone put toys inside food? What kind of society had such abundance that they could afford to give away prizes with candy? What kind of economy could sustain such frivolous generosity? Sergeant Bradley laughed at their expressions, clearly amused by their shock. "Prize inside," he explained, gesturing to show the surprise element. "Kids love it." Cracker Jack always has a prize. The 4 German women stood in the administration office, holding their Cracker Jack boxes like sacred objects, staring at the tiny toys in their palms. In that moment, something fundamental shifted. This wasn't military rations or strategic generosity. This was ordinary American childhood, the baseline of civilian life that included toys hidden in candy boxes just for fun. If this was what American children took for granted, what did that mean about everything they had been told about American poverty and desperation? That evening in Barrack 7, the Cracker Jack boxes became the center of intense discussion among the German women. Ursula sat on her bunk, turning the tiny compass over in her fingers, while conversations swirled around her in urgent German whispers. Senta had heard about the incident from the women who worked in administration and had spread the story throughout both barracks. Now everyone wanted to see the evidence with their own eyes. The small toys were passed from hand to hand like religious relics, each woman examining them with expressions ranging from wonder to distress. "It's propaganda," one woman insisted, a former factory worker from Munich named Gisela. "They're trying to convince us of American superiority with cheap tricks." But Helga shook her head, her teacher's mind working through the logical implications. "Propaganda would be showing us these things deliberately," she argued. "The sergeant shared them casually, the way you'd share something ordinary and unremarkable. He didn't make a show of it. He didn't call attention to American abundance. He just handed out candy the way anyone might during a work break." Mina held up the tiny whistle she had found in her box. "These toys are manufactured," she said quietly. "Thousands of them must be produced to put one in every box. That requires industrial capacity, resources, design effort, all for something that children receive free with candy and probably throw away after a few days." The implications were staggering. Germany's entire industrial might had been focused on war production for years. Civilian goods had become increasingly scarce, luxuries had disappeared, and even basic necessities were rationed carefully. Yet America, while fighting a war on 2 fronts, still had the industrial capacity to manufacture toys as throwaway prizes in candy boxes. Ursula found her voice, though speaking the words felt like betrayal. "My brothers used to talk about the shortages before I was captured," she said slowly. "Rubber, metal, fuel, everything was desperately needed for the war effort. We were told that America was suffering even worse shortages, that their economy was collapsing under the strain of war production." She held up the tiny compass. "But they're putting metal compasses in candy boxes, not to boost morale or support the war effort, just because that's what they do normally, even during wartime." The silence that followed her observation was heavy with implications none of them wanted to fully acknowledge. If America had such abundance that they could waste resources on toys and candy boxes during wartime, what did that say about German propaganda claims of American weakness? What did it say about the inevitable German victory they had all been promised? Adelheid spoke from her corner bunk, her medical training lending weight to her analytical approach. "I've been working in their infirmary for 3 weeks," she said. "They have medicines I've never seen before. Antibiotics, painkillers, supplies that never run short. And they use them on us, on enemy prisoners, without hesitation. That's not the action of a country struggling with scarcity." Young Senta, who usually stayed quiet during these discussions, surprised everyone by speaking up. "My father worked in a factory making ball bearings," she said softly. "Before I left for service, he told me that Germany would win because we were more efficient, more disciplined, more focused than the Americans." In the weeks following the Cracker Jack incident, the German women found themselves observing everything with new eyes. Each detail of American camp life became evidence in an ongoing internal trial where their previous beliefs stood accused of being false. Captain Morrison had provided the prisoners with writing paper and pencils, allowing them to compose letters home, subject to military censorship. The letters would be held until the war ended, but the act of writing provided emotional release and a way to process their experiences. Ursula sat at one of the long tables in the barracks, pen in hand, trying to find words that could convey what she was experiencing. She began multiple times, crossing out lines that seemed too treasonous to commit to paper, even in a letter that might never be sent. "Dear Mama and Papa," she finally wrote, "I am well and being treated in accordance with international law. The Americans provide adequate food and shelter. Please do not worry about my circumstances." She paused, reading the careful, neutral words of "As sirs." They were true but empty, revealing nothing of the transformation happening inside her. On a separate piece of paper, one she would never submit for censorship, she began writing what she really wanted to say. "Dear Mama, I don't know how to tell you this. I don't know if I should, but everything we believed about America was wrong. Not slightly wrong or exaggerated, completely, fundamentally wrong. They have abundance beyond anything I can adequately describe. Yesterday, an American soldier complained that his coffee wasn't hot enough. Complained about coffee temperature, as if having unlimited coffee is a right rather than a luxury. I've seen them throw away food that would feed a German family for days. Not rotten food, perfectly good food that they simply didn't want to finish. Their prisoners eat better than our civilians. I don't know what this means for Germany or for the war or for everything I believed I was fighting for." She stopped writing, her hand trembling. Even in an unsendable letter, the words felt dangerous. Across the table, Helga was working on her own unsendable letter. As a former teacher, she approached the task analytically, trying to document observations rather than emotions. "The American Guards are conscripted citizens, not professional soldiers," she wrote. "They come from farms and small towns and cities across this vast country. Most are younger than 25. They speak openly about wanting to go home, about missing their families, about their impatience with military discipline. Yet they perform their duties competently, without the rigid structure we were taught made German military superiority inevitable. This suggests that democratic societies may not be as weak and undisciplined as our doctrine claimed." In her corner, Mina was composing a technical analysis disguised as a personal letter. Her communications training had taught her to observe patterns and systems. "The infrastructure here is remarkable," she wrote. "Electricity runs constantly. Water is available at any time. Heating systems function reliably. The Americans take these things for granted, becoming irritated when anything functions below optimal efficiency. They have no concept of making do with shortages or rationing resources. This is their baseline normal, not a temporary wartime condition." Young Senta's letter was simpler and more emotional. "I miss you so much, but I'm not sure the Germany I return to will be the one I left. Or maybe Germany hasn't changed, but I have. I don't know how to explain what I'm learning here." December 23, 1944 brought an unexpected development that would further challenge the German prisoners' understanding of their situation. Captain Morrison announced that the International Red Cross had delivered Christmas packages for distribution to all prisoners of war, including the German women at Camp Ellis. The packages arrived in the mess hall during afternoon assembly, stacked in neat rows on tables near the serving line. Each box bore Red Cross markings and contained items donated by American civilians specifically for enemy prisoners. The concept itself was difficult for Ursula to process. American citizens, while their own sons and brothers fought German soldiers overseas, had voluntarily contributed goods to provide comfort to captured German personnel. The contradiction with propaganda claims about American hatred and barbarism was impossible to ignore. When Captain Morrison called the women forward to receive their packages, Ursula approached with the same cautious suspicion she had maintained since arrival. But as she opened the cardboard box with her name written on it in careful English script, that suspicion crumbled further. Inside she found a knitted scarf in soft blue wool, a bar of soap that smelled of lavender, a small bag of hard candies, a deck of playing cards, a paperback book in German, a novel by Thomas Mann that had been banned in Germany since 1933, and a handwritten note card that read, in careful English, "To a German prisoner, may you find peace this Christmas season. From the Riverside Lutheran Church Ladies Auxiliary, Davenport, Iowa." Ursula stared at the card, reading it multiple times. These American women had spent time and resources to provide comfort to enemy prisoners. They had knitted scarves and selected books and written personal notes to people they would never meet, people whose country was trying to kill their loved ones. Around her, other women were opening similar packages, finding similar treasures, reading similar notes. Senta began crying quietly, clutching a small stuffed bear that someone had tucked into her package. Mina held a pair of knitted mittens, her analytical mind clearly struggling to fit this evidence into any framework that made sense. Helga read her note card aloud, in a voice thick with emotion. "Dear German friend, we pray for your safe return home when this terrible war ends. We pray for peace between our nations. We pray that you know God's love even in captivity. The Henderson family, Cedar Rapids, Iowa." That evening, the German women sat in their barracks surrounded by the contents of their Red Cross packages, trying to reconcile this generosity with everything they had been taught about American character. These were not strategic gifts from military leadership. These were personal gestures from ordinary American civilians who had chosen compassion over hatred. "They pity us," Gisela said, her voice defensive. "They're trying to prove their moral superiority." But even as she spoke, her hands clutched the knitted scarf she had received, her fingers tracing the careful stitches that someone had labored over for hours. Ursula held the Thomas Mann novel, a book she had never been allowed to read in Germany. The symbolism was not lost on her. In America, even enemy prisoners had access to literature that the Reich had banned for its own citizens. Christmas Day in Camp Ellis was unlike anything the German prisoners had imagined. Captain Morrison had arranged for a small decorated tree in each barracks, and the mess hall served a special meal that included roasted turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, and pumpkin pie. The American guards who worked the holiday shift seemed cheerful rather than resentful, and several had brought small gifts for the prisoners they supervised regularly. Sergeant Bradley arrived at the administration building with a box of chocolates to share with his German workers. Private Cooper brought fresh cookies his mother had mailed from Iowa to distribute in the laundry facility. Lieutenant Chen gave each of her medical staff, including Heidi, a small pin bearing the medical caduceus symbol. These gestures were creating relationships that transcended the prisoner-guard dynamic. The German women found themselves having actual conversations with their American captors, struggling through language barriers to share stories about their families, their homes, their hopes for when the war finally ended. Ursula discovered that Sergeant Bradley had two daughters roughly her age. He showed her photographs from his wallet, his pride evident despite the language difficulties. She found herself telling him about her brothers, about Dresden before the war, about her work in France. The conversation was halting and incomplete, but it was genuine. For the first time since her capture, she was talking to an American not as an enemy, but as a person. In the medical facility, Heidi and Lieutenant Chen had developed an efficient working relationship that relied on shared professional knowledge rather than common language. Chen had begun teaching Heidi English medical terminology, while Heidi taught Chen some German. Their conversations often drifted beyond medicine to personal topics. Chen spoke about growing up in San Francisco as the daughter of Chinese immigrants, about facing prejudice while also finding opportunity. Her story complicated Ursula's understanding of American society in ways that propaganda had never addressed. Young Senta had become something of a mascot in the laundry facility, her youth and obvious homesickness touching the American soldiers who worked there. Private Cooper had taken a protective interest in her welfare, making sure she understood her tasks and wasn't overwhelmed by the work. He taught her English phrases, laughed at her mistakes without mockery, and shared stories about his younger sister back in Iowa who was about Senta's age. These connections were dangerous to the identity the German women had constructed around being loyal servants of the Reich. It was easier to maintain ideological purity when the enemy remained faceless and abstract. But Sergeant Bradley was not an abstract enemy. He was a middle-aged father from Ohio who showed pictures of his daughters and shared his coffee. Lieutenant Chen was not a faceless American oppressor. She was a second-generation immigrant who had worked her way through medical school despite discrimination. Private Cooper was not a ruthless soldier. He was a homesick farm boy who missed his family and treated everyone with instinctive Midwestern kindness. Helga articulated what many of them were feeling during an evening conversation in the barracks. "We can't hate people we know," she said quietly. "That's why propaganda always dehumanizes the enemy. Once you see them as individuals with families and dreams and kindness, once you see their humanity, you can't maintain the hatred necessary for war." January 1945 brought the first letters from Germany, carefully screened by both German and American censors before being delivered to the prisoners at Camp Ellis. Not every woman received mail, and many of the letters that did arrive carried devastating news. Ursula's letter came from a neighbor in Dresden, not from her parents. Her hands shook as she opened it, immediately understanding what that meant. The neighbor wrote in careful formal German that Ursula's parents had been killed in the Allied bombing raid of October 7, 1944. Her mother had died instantly when their apartment building collapsed. Her father had survived 3 days in a makeshift hospital before succumbing to his injuries. The neighbor had no news of Ursula's brothers. She sat on her bunk, holding the letter in numb hands, reading the words over and over without fully processing them. Her parents were dead. The family she had been writing unsendable letters to no longer existed. The home she had dreamed of returning to was rubble. Around her, similar scenes were playing out. Of the 43 German women at Camp Ellis, 28 had received letters. 17 of those letters contained news of deaths. Parents, siblings, children, husbands. The toll of Allied bombing and Soviet advance was documented in careful, censored language that couldn't hide the devastation. Mina learned that her entire neighborhood in Berlin had been destroyed. Adelheid discovered that her fiancé had been killed on the Eastern Front 6 months earlier. Senta's letter brought the most heartbreaking news of all. Her father, who had worked in the ball-bearing factory, had been killed in an industrial accident when the factory was bombed. Her mother and younger sister had been evacuated to the countryside, but to an unknown location. The letter, from a former neighbor, contained no information about how Senta might contact them. The grief that filled the barracks that night was profound and complicated. These women were mourning losses caused by the very forces that now held them captive. Yet those same captives had shown them more kindness and humanity than their own government ever had. The Americans who had destroyed their homes were also the Americans who shared coffee and Christmas packages and treated them with dignity. Captain Morrison arrived the next morning, her face showing genuine compassion. She had been informed of the letter's contents through the censorship process and had come to offer what comfort she could. Through a translator, she expressed condolences and offered access to the camp chaplain for anyone who wished to speak with him. The gesture was simple but meaningful. She didn't have to acknowledge their grief. She could have maintained professional distance and let them process their losses privately. But she chose to show up, to recognize their pain, to offer support. That afternoon, Ursula found herself in the camp chapel, a small building she had never entered before. Father Thomas O'Brien, the Catholic chaplain, spoke limited German, but offered his presence more than his words. She sat in a pew and cried for the first time since her capture, mourning not just her parents, but everything she had lost. Her country, her beliefs, her understanding of the world. February brought news that would shatter what remained of the German prisoners' faith in the Reich they had served. As Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory, they began discovering and liberating concentration camps. The first photographs and reports started appearing in American newspapers, and Captain Morrison made the difficult decision to share them with the German prisoners at Camp Ellis. She gathered the women in the mess hall on February 16, 1945. Her face was grave as she explained through a translator what they were about to see. These were not propaganda images, she emphasized. These were documentary photographs taken by American and British military photographers as evidence of what they had discovered. The first photograph showed the gates of Bergen-Belsen, with its infamous slogan. The next showed emaciated bodies stacked like cordwood, then images of survivors who looked more like skeletons than human beings. Gas chambers, crematoria, personal belongings sorted into massive piles, Shoes, glasses, human hair. Ursula stared at the photographs spread across the table, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were seeing. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be Germany. This couldn't be what she had been serving. But the evidence was undeniable. The photographs were too detailed, too numerous, too consistent to be fabrications. These places existed. These atrocities had occurred. These horrors had been perpetrated by the government she had sworn to serve. Around her, other women reacted with similar shock and denial. Some turned away, unable to look. Others leaned closer, as if proximity might reveal the images to be false. Senta vomited into a waste bin, her young face pale with horror. Helga sat down heavily, her teacher's rationality crumbling in the face of evidence that contradicted everything she had believed about German civilization and culture. "This is enemy propaganda," Gisela insisted, her voice desperate. "They've fabricated these images to justify their invasion of our homeland." But Captain Morrison had anticipated this reaction. She produced newspapers from neutral countries, Swiss and Swedish publications that confirmed the Allied reports. She provided testimony from international Red Cross observers who had visited the liberated camps. She offered to arrange for the women to speak with American soldiers who had participated in the liberations and could provide first-hand accounts. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. These camps existed. These crimes had been committed. These victims had suffered and died while ordinary Germans like themselves had claimed ignorance. Ursula felt something break inside her, some fundamental piece of her identity that could never be repaired. She had served the Reich believing she was defending her homeland. But her homeland had built factories of death. Her country had systematized murder. Her government had perpetrated evil on a scale that defied comprehension. "What have we done?" Mina whispered, speaking the question that haunted all of them. What were we part of? That night, no one in Barrack 7 slept. The women sat in small groups, speaking in hushed German, trying to process the impossible reality they now faced. The days following the revelation of the concentration camps were the darkest period of the German women's captivity. The physical conditions hadn't changed. The Americans continued to treat them with the same professional courtesy and unexpected kindness. But internally, each woman was grappling with questions of complicity, guilt, and identity that had no easy answers. Ursula stopped eating properly. She would sit in the mess hall with food in front of her and think about the starving prisoners in those photographs. How could she accept abundance while knowing what her countrymen had done? How could she enjoy the safety and comfort of American captivity while millions had suffered in German camps? Helga threw herself into research, requesting access to every newspaper and document about the camps that the Americans would provide. She needed to understand the scope of it, the systems that had enabled it, the signs that ordinary Germans should have seen. She was a teacher, trained to analyze and educate. She needed to understand how an entire nation could commit such evil while believing they were serving righteousness. Mina's guilt manifested differently. She had worked in communications, transmitting orders and information throughout the military network. Had her work facilitated these crimes? Had messages she transmitted sent people to these death camps? She couldn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at her. Adelheid found herself questioning every patient she had treated, every soldier she had helped recover. Had she helped men who participated in atrocities return to duty so they could commit more crimes? Her medical oath required her to treat all patients regardless of circumstance. But that principle felt hollow now. Young Senta was Senta, perhaps the most devastated. At 19, she had believed she was serving her country with honor. Now she discovered that her country had no honor. The father she had lost in the factory bombing had spent his last years producing materials for a government that built murder factories. The American staff at Camp Ellis watched the German prisoners' anguish with mixed emotions. Some felt the women deserved to suffer with this knowledge, that guilt was appropriate given what their country had done. But others, including Captain Morrison and Sergeant Bradley, recognized the difference between individual culpability and collective guilt. These women had served the Reich, yes, but they had not personally committed atrocities. Most had been unaware of the camp's existence. They were guilty of ignorance, of believing propaganda, of serving an evil system, but they were not guilty of the specific crimes that had been revealed. Father O'Brien began holding daily counseling sessions for any prisoner who wanted to speak with him. The chapel became a refuge where women could voice their guilt, their shame, their confusion about how to reconcile their past service with their current knowledge. God can forgive anything, the chaplain told them through a translator. But you must first forgive yourselves for not knowing what you could not have known. Then you must commit to being better than you were, to standing against such evil if you ever encounter it again. It was Lieutenant Chen who offered perhaps the most meaningful perspective during a conversation with Heidi in the medical facility. May 8, 1945, brought the news that everyone had anticipated, but few had prepared for emotionally. Victory in Europe Day, Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Captain Morrison gathered all the German prisoners in the mess hall that afternoon to make an official announcement. The war's end meant that repatriation procedures would begin. Within weeks, arrangements would be made to transport the German women back to their homeland. They would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to rebuild their lives in post-war Germany. The words that should have brought joy and relief instead created a heavy silence in the room. 6 months ago, these women would have celebrated the prospect of going home. But everything had changed. The Germany they would return to was not the country they had left. Ursula sat at one of the long tables, processing what repatriation meant. She had no family to return to. Her parents were dead, her brother's fates unknown. Dresden was in ruins, occupied by Soviet forces. What exactly was she returning to? A destroyed city in a defeated nation where she would be seen as part of the system that had committed unspeakable crimes? Around her, the other women were making similar calculations. Mina's Berlin was devastated. Helga's Hamburg had been firebombed. Senta didn't even know where her mother and sister were located. The homes they remembered no longer existed except in memory, but beyond the physical destruction was something deeper. These women had changed. They had seen American abundance and kindness. They had confronted the truth about the Reich they served. They had developed relationships with Americans that challenged everything they had been taught about enemies and hatred. They had discovered that the supposed inferior democracy had treated them with more dignity than their own superior system ever had. That evening in Barrack 7, the conversations were subdued and introspective. Some women expressed relief at the prospect of going home, despite the difficulties they would face. Germany was still Germany, still their homeland, regardless of its condition. Others voiced fears about what awaited them. Would they be punished for their service to the Reich? Would they face retribution from occupation forces? Would they be able to find work and housing in the chaos of post-war Germany? But a small group, led by Ursula, began discussing something that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. What if they didn't return to Germany immediately? What if they found a way to remain in America, at least temporarily? The idea was radical and complicated. They were still technically prisoners of war. They had no legal status to remain in the United States. But the thought of returning to nothing, of facing a destroyed homeland and an uncertain future, felt overwhelming. Here at Camp Ellis, they had found something unexpected. Not just physical safety and abundance, but a sense of possibility. They had been treated as individuals capable of change, rather than as irredeemable enemies. They had been shown what redemption might look like. Over the following week, the discussions in Barrack 7 grew more intense and more desperate. Ursula found herself at the center of conversations that would have been treasonous just months earlier. The idea of choosing to remain in America, of not immediately returning to Germany, was taking root in multiple hearts simultaneously. Helga articulated what many were feeling during a late-night discussion. "We return to what?" she asked quietly. "To cities that no longer exist? To a country that will spend decades living down the shame of what was done in its name? To a society that will either deny the camps existed or blame everyone who served in any capacity?" Mina added her practical analysis. "The occupation zones are chaotic. Food is scarce. Infrastructure is destroyed. The Americans, British, French, and Soviets are dividing the country between them. We have no idea what legal status we'll have, what rights we'll possess, whether we'll even be safe." Adelheid spoke from her medical perspective. "I've been reading about the conditions in Germany through the newspapers Captain Morrison allows us to see. Disease is rampant. Malnutrition is widespread. The medical system has collapsed. I could help people there, yes, but I could also help people here, and perhaps do more good with access to proper supplies and training. Young Senta's contribution was simpler and more emotional. I don't know where my mother and sister are, she said, her voice breaking. I could spend months searching for them in the chaos. And what if I can't find them? What if they're in the Soviet zone and I can't reach them? I'd be alone in a destroyed country with nothing and no one. But not everyone agreed with this line of thinking. Gisela remained adamant that returning to Germany was their duty. Our country needs us now more than ever, she argued. We can't abandon Germany in its darkest hour just because America is more comfortable. That would make us cowards and traitors. The debate revealed fundamental differences in how the women had processed their 6 months in American captivity. Some, like Gisela, had maintained a wall between themselves and their captors. They had accepted American kindness, but hadn't allowed it to fundamentally change their identity as Germans serving Germany. Others, like Ursula, had undergone a more profound transformation. The kindness they had experienced, combined with the revelation of the concentration camps, had shattered their previous worldview. They no longer knew who they were or what they believed. The only certainty was that returning to Germany felt like stepping back into a nightmare they had briefly escaped. On May 15th, Captain Morrison called Ursula to her office for a private conversation. The meeting would change everything. Through a translator, the captain asked a direct question. If it were possible, would you choose to remain in the United States rather than return to Germany? Ursula hesitated, knowing her answer would define the rest of her life. Yes, she finally said, I would choose to stay. Captain Morrison's question to Ursula had not been idle curiosity. She had been observing the German prisoners for 6 months, noting their transformation, their anguish over the camp revelations, their obvious anxiety about repatriation. She had consulted with her superiors about the unprecedented situation developing at Camp Ellis. Some of these women genuinely had nothing to return to and had demonstrated sincere remorse for their country's actions. On May 20th, Morrison called a general assembly for all German prisoners. She stood before them with documents from the War Department, her expression serious but not unkind. Speaking through the translator, she explained that repatriation remained the default expectation. Transportation would be arranged within 3 weeks. But then she said something no German prisoner in any American camp had heard before. However, Morrison continued, given the unusual circumstances and the ongoing chaos in occupied Germany, the War Department has authorized a limited exception. Those who wish to remain in the United States temporarily may petition for reclassification as displaced persons rather than prisoners of war. This status would allow you to seek sponsorship, employment, and eventual immigration status. The words hung in the air like an impossible dream. Ursula felt her heart racing. This was real. This was actually being offered. Morrison continued with the practical details. Displaced person status meant they would no longer be housed or supported by the military. They would need to find American families or organizations willing to sponsor them, provide housing, and vouch for their character. They would need to find employment. They would need to navigate immigration procedures that were complex and uncertain. It was a risk with no guarantees. The assembly dissolved into urgent German conversations. Some women immediately declared their intention to return to Germany. Others wanted time to consider. But 9 women, led by Ursula, knew their answer. You're abandoning our country when it needs us most, she said bitterly. History will remember you as traitors who chose comfort over duty. June 15, 1945 arrived with bittersweet finality, the day when the German prisoners at Camp Ellis would separate, some returning to their defeated homeland, others embarking on an uncertain American future. Captain Morrison had received final approval from Washington 3 days earlier. The 9 women who requested displaced person status would be released into the sponsorship of various American families and organizations. The remaining 34 would board transport ships to Europe within the week. The morning assembly in the mess hall felt more like a family gathering than a military procedure. 6 months of shared experience had created bonds that transcended nationality and war. These women had supported each other through grief, revelation, and transformation. Now they were choosing different paths forward, but the connection would remain. Ursula stood to address the group, her English now fluent enough to speak without a translator. "We are not abandoning Germany," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "We are choosing to honor what Germany should have been by embracing what we have learned here. Some of you will rebuild our homeland with your hands and your courage. We will carry the lessons of reconciliation and redemption to build bridges between our nations." Gisela stepped forward, her expression softened from the bitter anger of previous days. "I still believe you should return with us," she said quietly. "But I understand why you're staying. Perhaps both paths serve Germany in different ways. You can be ambassadors here while we work to create a country worthy of the name again." The women who were returning boarded trucks that afternoon, carrying letters from their American friends, photographs from their time at Camp Ellis, and small gifts that represented the unexpected connections they had formed. They carried something more important as well, the knowledge that former enemies could show mercy, that redemption was possible, that humanity could transcend nationalism. The 9 who remained stood watching the trucks depart, feeling the weight of their choice settle on their shoulders. They were no longer prisoners. They were no longer German military personnel. They were displaced persons seeking new identities in a foreign land. The Henderson family arrived that evening to collect Ursula. Mrs. Henderson embraced her like a daughter, speaking slowly in English about the room they had prepared, the job interview they had arranged at the local library, the English classes at the community center. Mina was sponsored by a Lutheran congregation in Davenport. Helga found placement with a university professor's family in Iowa City who needed help with their children while valuing her teaching credentials. Adelheid was accepted into a nursing program at a Chicago hospital with sponsorship from the Catholic diocese. Young Senta was taken in by the Cooper family, Private Cooper's parents, insisting that the girl who had worked so hard in the laundry deserved a real family to support her. As Ursula left Camp Ellis for the last time, she carried only a small bag of possessions, but she also carried the Cracker Jack compass that had started her transformation, a symbol of how something small and ordinary could reveal profound truths. 23 years later, in 1968, Ursula Braun Henderson stood in a university lecture hall in Iowa City, invited to speak about post-war, reconciliation, and the immigrant experience. She was 47 years old now, an American citizen, a librarian, a mother of 2 children who had never known war. The small Cracker Jack compass sat on the podium before her as she began her presentation. This compass, she told the audience of students and faculty, was given to me in a box of candy by an American sergeant who was simply sharing his afternoon snack. He had no idea that this simple gesture would change my entire understanding of the world. She spoke about arriving at Camp Ellis expecting cruelty and finding kindness, about being fed abundance while believing Americans were starving, about seeing toys in candy boxes while Germany's entire economy was focused on desperate survival, about how small acts of unexpected humanity could shatter years of propaganda and hatred. The Cracker Jack moment was when I first understood that everything I believed might be wrong, she explained. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a logical argument. It was simply evidence that American children received toys for free with their candy, while German propaganda claimed Americans were desperate and failing. That contradiction created a crack in my certainty. Everything else followed from that crack. The other 8 women who had chosen to stay had found their own paths to contribution and belonging. Wilhelmina Schulze had become a translator for the State Department. Helga Kruger earned her doctorate and taught German literature at the University of Chicago. Adelheid Zimmerman served as head nurse at Cook County Hospital. Senta Huber Cooper had married an American soldier, raised 4 children, addressed to Captain Morrison and signed by 9 women: Ursula Braun, Wilhelmine Schulze, Helga Kruger, Adelheid Zimmerman, Senta Huber, and 4 others. Captain Morrison, we respectfully request reclassification as displaced persons and permission to remain in the United States. We have nothing to return to in Germany. We have discovered in American captivity values of dignity, opportunity, and redemption that we wish to embrace fully. We wish to demonstrate through our actions and our lives that transformation is possible, that former enemies can become friends, that individuals can choose to be better than the systems that formed them. We understand the difficulties we face. We accept the uncertainty, but we believe that choosing to stay and build new lives here is choosing hope over despair, future over past. We humbly ask for the chance to prove ourselves worthy of this extraordinary opportunity. The letter represented an unprecedented request in the history of American prisoner of war operations. German prisoners begging to remain with their captors rather than accept freedom to return home. Morrison read the letter twice, understanding its historical significance. Then, she picked up her phone to begin making calls. The decision by 9 German prisoners to request displaced person status leaked to local newspapers within days. The story spread quickly, generating reactions that ranged from supportive to hostile across Illinois and beyond. The Peoria Journal ran an editorial titled, "Enemy Prisoners Seek American Dream." The Chicago Tribune published a more skeptical piece questioning whether Nazi personnel should receive special consideration while American soldiers still fought in the Pacific. Local radio stations debated the issue, with callers expressing passionate opinions on both sides. Some Americans argued that showing mercy to former enemies demonstrated American values at their finest. Others insisted that these women should face the consequences of their country's actions by returning to rebuild Germany. Religious organizations were among the first to step forward with support. Father O'Brien contacted the Catholic Diocese of Peoria, which began organizing potential sponsors. The Riverside Lutheran Church in Davenport, the same congregation that had sent Christmas packages, offered to sponsor 2 of the women. The Henderson family from Cedar Rapids, who had included the note about praying for peace, contacted Captain Morrison directly, offering to sponsor Ursula specifically. Mrs. Henderson, the school teacher who had organized the Christmas delegation, saw in Ursula's request something profoundly American. The belief that people could transform themselves, that past mistakes didn't have to define future possibilities, that redemption was available to those willing to work for it. But opposition was also organized and vocal. A veterans group in Chicago sent a telegram to the War Department protesting any special treatment for German prisoners. They argued that while American families grieved sons killed by German forces, the government was considering allowing German military personnel to remain in the country. The debate reached Washington. Congressmen received letters from constituents on both sides. The story became a symbol of larger questions about justice, forgiveness, and American identity in the post-war world. What did it mean to be American? Was it about birthplace and blood, or about embracing certain values and principles? Could former enemies become Americans if they genuinely transformed? At Camp Ellis, the 9 women who had requested to stay waited anxiously while their fate was decided in offices and committees far from their control. They continued their work assignments, maintained their routines, but every day brought the repatriation date closer. The other German prisoners who had chosen to return to Germany prepared for departure with mixed emotions. Some were relieved to be going home despite the difficulties awaiting them. Others seemed almost envious of those who had found the courage to choose a different path. Gisela, still insistent that returning to Germany was the only honorable choice, confronted Ursula one final time before the divided group would separate forever. "You're abandoning our country when it needs us most," for children, and worked as a teacher's aide in the Iowa public school system. Their collective story had influenced American immigration policy and attitudes toward former enemies. They proved that transformation was possible, that showing mercy could create allies from adversaries, that American values of redemption and second chances could forge stronger bonds than military victory alone. But perhaps their most important legacy was the example they set for how individuals could choose to transcend the worst aspects of their history. They had served an evil system, but they had not been defined by that service. They had been given the opportunity to become something better, and they had seized that opportunity with both hands. Ursula concluded her lecture by holding up the tiny compass. "This showed me a new direction when I was lost," she said. "America gave me the freedom to follow that direction, to discover who I could become, rather than being trapped by who I had been. That is the true power of this country. Not its military might or economic strength, but its capacity to offer second chances to those willing to earn them." In the audience, her daughter, Sarah, sat listening with pride. Sarah had grown up knowing her mother's story, understanding the weight of history and the possibility of redemption. She was studying international relations, hoping to build on her mother's legacy of reconciliation. The Cracker Jack compass, that tiny toy meant to be thrown away after a moment's amusement, had become a family heirloom. It represented the moment when propaganda met reality and reality won. When hatred met kindness and kindness prevailed. When enemies discovered